annakski sõna Jakob von Uexkullile selleks, et ta siis räägiks, mis asi on World Future Council või mismoodi ta peaks välja nägema ja mida meie seal saaksime teha või kuidas osaleda. I hope you understood everything I said, having been so many times here. But please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My apologies for not being able to speak in Estonian. I want to thank Toomas for introducing me, Doris for organizing this, and of course the Academy of Sciences and the UNESCO Commission for hosting this event for me to talk about the World Future Council initiative for the first time in the Baltics. I realize this is a difficult time, unexpectedly, at this time of mourning, for Laupmaa, this remarkable man. And I was reminded when I was interviewed in Estonian radio this morning they asked, what I had remembered of our meetings, and I thought back to the first one in 1989 when I came here as a member of the European Parliament. And of course we didn't know any of these people here in the independence movement, but Laupmaa immediately stood out. And one aspect which has perhaps not been so much remembered is that the attitude in Western Europe, the European Union, was very much against an independent Estonia and very much in favor of a Baltic Union. If you that the progress towards greater self-determination should be made by the three Baltic states as a union. I remember the head of my delegation was arguing, and of course I knew very little about the Baltic and Estonian history, was arguing with Henri about this, saying this is, in Europe, you must understand, this is not the age of small countries anymore, it's the age of unions. The first thing you must do is to form a Baltic political union and become one country. And Henri realized that it was impossible to argue rationally with this man, and so in the end this story I decided not to tell it in a radio interview because I thought it might be misunderstood out of context. So he looked around and saw that there were no non-Estonians there, and he turned to the German politician, the EU politician, and said in a sort of loud conspirational whisper, the Baltic Union would never work. We Estonians are far too afraid of Lithuanian imperialism. And there was no more argument after that from any of the European parliamentarians. And Henri was somebody who was clearly trusted, and I think that's why the rapid changes here are also possible. With trusted leaders, you can do almost anything, and without them, you can do almost nothing. And that's not a new statement. You can find that in the philosophy of Confucius. He says the most important thing for an emperor needs several things. He needs bread to give to the people, he needs an army to defend himself against enemies, and he needs the trust of his people. But Confucius says of the three, the trust is the most important. Without that, there will be collapse. Machiavelli says more or less the same thing. If the trust breaks down between the people and its leaders, they're heading for disaster. And that great historian of civilizations, Professor Arnold Toynbee, wrote that having studied dozens of civilizations rise and collapse, the most frequent ground for that collapse was when, as he put it, the elites lost their charm, when the leaders were no longer trusted. Of course, today, we have the most urgent crisis and biggest crisis facing us ever, because it's a global crisis in the world today, and the trust in our political leaders, especially also in democratic countries, is lower than it probably ever was. Now, there was an opinion poll in Germany last year where political leaders were trusted, the government was trusted by about 10%, while almost 50% trusted Aldi. I don't know if it exists here, it's a cut-price supermarket chain. They did another poll, this was by Gallup and the BBC World Service, in 68 countries, and they found that politicians came lowest among the groups of individuals, of people who are trusted, and religious leaders and even academics came far above politicians. when people were asked which group of people they had trust in. And it gets even worse. One study in Germany among young people about 7-8 years ago found that while only 3 to 5% trusted politicians and governments and political parties, about 50 and 60% trusted organizations like Greenpeace and Amnesty. When they did a similar study a few years ago, they found that even Greenpeace and Amnesty were only trusted by about 28 to 30%. And an absolute majority of young Germans said that there was no organization or institution in society which they trusted. So today we are facing the most difficult journey which humanity has ever undertaken, needing trusted leadership more than ever, and we have it less than ever. Which of course results in a vicious circle. The less trusted leaders are, the less they dare to do, the less they can do, and therefore they get trusted even less. And so the circle continues. The scale of the problem we're facing is probably best illustrated by former US Vice President Al Gore, who wrote a book just before he became Vice President, which he largely wrote himself. This is quite rare, where he looked at the global environmental situation and also at climate change in those days. And he said that this is so serious that, and he wrote in the central passage in the book, that we need to rethink every agreement, every law, every constitution, every international treaty. Everything needs to be rethought and reformulated from the point of view of trying to heal and protect and preserve our natural environment. And after he had been Vice President, he was then interviewed by an American writer who said, well, what did you do? What have you done? And Gore answered, the problem today is that the minimum of what is necessary scientifically and environmentally is more than the maximum of what is politically feasible or even thinkable. And he obviously felt he hadn't been able to change that. So the main focus of the World Future Council initiative is to enlarge the space of what is seen as politically possible. And obviously that has to do with, highlighting the threat, showing that there is in a crisis. If people feel they're in a crisis and they trust their leaders, then you can change things very, very rapidly. When the United Kingdom and Britain decided, when Churchill came to power and they decided to face up to the Nazis and declared war, then private use of motor cars in Britain was reduced by 95% in less than 3 months. So it clearly can be done. At the same time, of course, people have had the feeling that there are solutions, there are alternatives, and that the sacrifice they make is worthwhile. And that's, of course, a challenge we face today. Now, the key global issue today, the key global threat, is without doubt what is now being called climate chaos. I mean, as we've seen here around us today, at this beginning of spring, we don't really have global warming, we have climate chaos. This has been called a threat so large as to almost defy comprehension by a British writer, Mark Linus, who studied this. He went, for example, to glaciers in South America, where his father had been as a scientist 20 years ago and photographed them, and he went back and photographed them, and they'd almost gone. People started realizing that this was happening much, much faster than anybody had previously realized. I mean, it's happening much faster, I would say, than even the Greens and Greenpeace predicted 15 years ago. It is clearly an overriding threat. Take the connection with water. It is now thought that 40% of the world's population in the year 2020, so we're not talking about here our grandchildren, those lifestyles, we're talking about in 15 years and 40 years, will not have enough water for their own needs to grow their own food. And this is, until a few years ago, was something which was regarded as not absolutely serious and sure. It was a minority opinion. Within the last year or two, it's suddenly become almost conventional wisdom. I mean, some people will deny it, but you can go to the Davos World Economic Forum now, where all the global players, the main capitalists and politicians meet, and the presentations on climate change basically confirm what I just said.
And an Indian businessman who'd been to Davos last year came to me afterwards. We met at the conference a few weeks later, and after what he'd heard about climate change, he said to me, "But what is the use of all my family's business and philanthropic work in India if the monsoon rains stop coming?" And it suddenly hit home to him that, this is obviously a threat of such overriding importance that, nothing will survive it. It is no good planning for the future, buying if you're American, well, they still think that somehow they can get away from this, and you see these maps of Florida, and what will happen if the sea waters rise according to some predictions and according to other predictions, and you see that if you have bought as an investment for your children or grandchildren some nice property on the seafront, well, even with a small global warming that will go, but if global warming becomes as bad as many serious scientists have predicted, the whole of Florida will basically be gone. So these are the realities we're talking about. Then we get suddenly, again, something which a Club of Rome warned about 30 years ago, the limits to growth, oil, the so-called peak oil scenario. Not that suddenly there will be no oil, but that within the next few years we are reaching the maximum reserves of global oil. After that it will become a scarcer and scarcer resource with ever-increasing prices. And our whole civilization is built not on oil, but on cheap oil, relatively cheap oil. Suddenly this again has become conventional wisdom. The editor of the in-house of the industry magazine Petroleum Review last year said it's like a tsunami, it's happening so fast. Even the US Energy Department said it's an unprecedented problem, even they're no longer denying it. And one of the persons who's written a lot about this is the Swiss Member of Parliament. He called together these peak oil experts with Swiss bankers. And at the end of the conference, the Swiss banker said, "But if you're right, we have no idea what to do. The whole financial system we have built up, our global financial system, is based on continued growth. And if we don't have that anymore because, there's no more cheap oil, we don't know what to do." And to give you an idea, much of our present wealth, in quotation marks, our monetary wealth, is based on expectations of future profits and growth. Now, if suddenly that disappears, if you realize there aren't going to be these future profits, then, for example, your pension funds, which have invested in these companies, will suddenly find their assets evaporate. So that's what makes the transition so very difficult. And our experts literally don't know what to do. And I realize this is a difficult message to put in a country like Estonia, which has worked so hard in recent years to join a world which is now showing itself to be as unviable, as unsustainable, this world order, as, in many ways, as the Soviet system was. And I always say that in my talks, because I know it will shock, and I'm sure it will shock here too, and people say, well, of course there's a big difference, of course there are huge differences. But there are also some remarkable, and for me, quite shocking similarities. Because when I read now about, in all the magazines and newspapers about China and India, which they have now sort of compressed some of them to Xinjiang, there's this enormous expectation, there's huge growth, they're so productive, and they're going to just take over the world, or whatever. And I'm reminded very much of those naive Western journalists and others who went to Stalin's Soviet Union in the 1930s, and they were so impressed by the productivity of this slave labor building, these huge canals and everything. And they came back, and you could read even in papers like the New York Times that the Soviet Union is going to overtake the West within a few decades or whatever, because it is so productive. And they read all these 5-year plans, and they were incredibly impressed with all this statistics. And this belief went on in many circles in the West, until the 1960s. It's still a belief that this productivity and effectivity. And I now find the same from these Westerners who go to China, especially to another communist dictatorship. And they come back and they have seen these plans. When you look at some of these plans, I saw one recently, and the authors, very cleverly, you couldn't do this under Stalin's time, also you'd be executed, but this Chinese author had said, well, the likelihood of this plan actually happening is, I estimate, about 6%. But still you will find this plan being published in Western papers about these Chinese, how innovative they're going to be and how they're going to solve all these problems. And when you talk to the Chinese, of course, to government representative to scientists, they talk a very different language. They say, our economic growth is already hitting environmental limits. We're extremely worried, we don't know what to do. The air in the cities, the metropolis of southern China is so bad that it's literally dying. They don't use the word air pollution anymore, the air is dying. People are collapsing in the streets, you can't breathe it. No Westerner wants to work there. Water, China has to fight for every drop of water. So the Chinese Minister of Water Resources fight to the death for every drop of water. Huge problems. Soil erosion through global warming, dust storms in northern China. So, fortunately, the Chinese in history have had a few challenges like this, and they changed course rapidly. The Chinese elites stopped their favorite pastimes for centuries because they realized that they were hunting too much and they were destroying too much wildlife. And then they denuded the country of forests to build this huge flotilla of ocean-going ships. They realized again the problem, and they stopped it. They banned all ocean-going ship travel. So it's interesting how now they are getting very interested. Now whether they can succeed in time, we don't know. But they are building. The friend of mine who was working with me on the World Future Council Initiative, Professor Herbert Girardi, is an expert on sustainable cities, and he is now working for a company called Arup Associates to help them build the first eco-city on an island in the river near Shanghai called Dongtang Eco-City. And this is meant to be one of many. And of course, it has to be unless it becomes far too late. But of course, at the same time, they are facing these huge expectations and social problems. I mean, what you have at the moment is that, yes, neoliberal capitalism has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into debt. I mean, they may earn a bit more, but the resources they are used to or they expect have become, too pricey for them. So basically, according to an interview with a Chinese expert in Der Spiegel just a few weeks ago, 40% of the ill people who get sick in China can no longer afford a doctor because doctors have become too expensive. And in India, you have a similar thing. A small minority is benefiting, while the rest are finding that they have moved from poverty into debt. 73% in India said in an interview by a major Indian magazine last October, they can no longer afford the health and education services, which they used to be able to afford. And of course, these social and environmental threats and challenges are interconnected. I went to Kerala in southern India last year, and I saw these fishermen there, with Stone Age fishing canoes cut out of a tree trunk going out, and they came back with these pathetic small amounts of fish. And I said, has this always been like that? They say, no, it gets less and less. And the old saying, and this wise saying, if you see a poor man, don't give him a fish, give him a fishing net or a rod to catch a fish. That's very good as long as there's fish. But, if there's no more fish, it doesn't really work anymore. So, Al Gore was right. We need to rethink and redo everything we do. And then the question, of course, is can this be done by the institutions we now have? Well, as you know, after the Second World War, the world didn't continue the League of Nations. It created a new institution. And it has created a number of new institutions since then. And one of the founding fathers of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, once said that the most important thing for every generation is to create the right institutions. And that's, of course, why the World Future Council comes in, saying, it's not going to solve all our problems, but without such an institution, it's not clear that we are going to be able to solve them in time. Of course, we also need national, we need regional, we need local future councils. We need Estonian Future Council, I'm sure Italian Future Council. But we have to start with the global framework. I mean, that's the one I know about. I'm a generalist. I mean, I have seen that there are solutions to these problems. I don't pretend to know the solutions to local problems, but it's quite clear that when we therefore have the World Future Council, we are going to need also local and regional councils for it to interact with, to feed down. It's going to be both sort of, feeding information down and also, of course, getting information. Now, the most interesting initiative in this respect is in Switzerland, on the cantonal level, on the regional level, where they said these future councils are useless if they're just somebody which, an NGO, just a group of people who come together and they are ignored. We need them as constitutional bodies. The first attempt was to create like a third legislative chamber, like a future council with kind of veto power. Now that didn't work in a democracy. That would not work, I think. But then they said at least if they are if they are actually there as a constitutional body with a task to help the government and the parliament to prepare for the future of this canton or this country, whatever, then their advice can't really be ignored. You could maybe even think of a way that they could only, if the parliament didn't agree with them, it needed a bigger majority, qualified as maybe a 3/4 majority or 2/3, to override their recommendations. But even the fact that they are a constitutional body would give them a lot of power. And the World Future Council, of course, will be a body power of which will only be moral. But that shouldn't be underestimated, because basically all power is based on its ethical, cultural acceptance. If you don't have that, then you can try with brute force, but you don't get very far. And the World Future Council has been endorsed by former UN Secretary General Dr. Boutros Ghali, by the former head of the World Bank, James Wolfenson, by the current chair of the UN General Assembly. Just to give you some names, it has been endorsed by politicians, by entrepreneurs, by academics, by NGO representatives, by grassroots, non-governmental organizations in many countries over the last few years. It's based on the idea that we don't need a new ethics. If we did, the situation would be hopeless. Where it's supposed to come from? It's based, with this firm belief that we know what to do. People have values as world citizens. We have values as parents, and we also have values as consumers. But the question is, which of these values are supported by society? Are the institutions, the rules, the information streams of society, are they all supporting lesser values, consumer values? Are we represented by our governments only as global consumers, thinking short-term, selfish people, or are we also represented as world citizens, with a broader, more long-term concern? Because of course we've always been consumers, but that was never our primary belief. And I first came across this idea of building such a council in a book by the Dalai Lama. He said, we really need now sort of a body of people of ethical integrity as a sort of conscience of the world. And this idea, we took this further. What is unique now about the World Future Council, well, you find it in the papers here. I'm not going to repeat what is in there. But we said it needs to be values-based. It is based on the belief that we don't need to invent a new ethics, that we have common values. Now they're expressed in different ways, but still, if you just be very, very brief, if you ask everybody, I believe, unless they're a pervert, they say, I want to live so as to hand over a better, or at least not a worse world to my children. And I don't think any previous generation did not believe in that, because if you had not believed in that, we would not be here, because they would have destroyed the earth long ago. Secondly, I think everybody would say, I want to be able to trust and be trusted. Now that also implies that, I'm trusted to have maybe different values. I'm trusted that I will not be killed because I trust I will not be killed because I have different values. Basically, this mutual trust and respect, and those are, to me, the basis for asserting that there are common values. There's a common ground for this. And I sat in a commission some years ago which drafted a declaration of human duties and responsibilities for UNESCO, which then was blocked by the United States, which never got voted on. It was interesting to me to see how broad the consensus was. It's known as the Valencia Declaration, that you could actually get a very, very broad consensus on quite a radical, in a good sense of the word, statement on the fact that all the rights we have, human rights, also imply duties and imply responsibilities. Now, the second thing I think about the World Future Council, which is unique, is that it's implementation-oriented, it's action-oriented. You will find many organizations in the world today will produce very beautiful, non-binding documents and final declarations. And then usually that's the end of it. They disband, they have no more money, they then think it's up to somebody else to actually implement it. And what we are doing is we are bringing together a database of the best policies worldwide. What are the best policies in the world which exist, which are effective on solving certain problems? For example, if you talk about building in cities, passive solar building, ecological building, it turns out the Barcelona Solar City Building Ordinance is actually the best one we come across, because it's much stricter and more broader than anything else. And you'll find that in a number of areas. Now we are working with members of parliament, we're going to work with them. I mean, we have, I should say so far, the World Future Council has not yet started its work because it doesn't have the resources, but the initiative for a World Future Council has been working very closely with another initiative, which is also still raising funds to get started, called the e-Parliament. The e-Parliament, the idea behind the e-Parliament is we don't need a new world parliament, it already exists. It consists of all democratically elected national members of parliament in the world, and you can bring them together with the help of electronics. Then you have basically created a world parliament. And we're working with civil society. We've had sent out messages, requests for information, for nominations for the council to about 8,000 organizations in about 20 countries and to many thousands of individuals. And we then found that we were approached by politicians who said, oh, this council would really be very good as an advisory body to governments. And one of those who approached us was from a conservative, oil-producing small country in the Middle East. And I said to him, well, have you read the book? This is not too radical for you. And he said, well, it's solutions, it's about solutions, and we need solutions. And we had a similar response recently from the UN, a high-level official in the UN who said this could become a high-level advisory body, permanent advisory body to the UN Secretary General, because at the moment, again, we only have these short-term commissions. So what we need to do in some areas is to speed up the implementation of what's already known. And, to give you an idea, housing, for example, the rebuilding, reconditioning of the housing stock, which needs now to be done to maximize energy saving, maximize ecological building. In a normal course, that is something which happens in a period of 30 to 50 years. We probably need to speed it up about tenfold. So we need a massive reconditioning and rebuilding, especially reconditioning of our housing according to ecological and energy saving guidelines. As I said, much of this is already known. The information is there, we just need to do it. And that's in other areas we need a lot of new thinking. The areas of finance and money, for example. How do you raise funds for this? You actually need to do redistribution. You need to tax currency speculation, aircraft, fuel, etc. Well, many good ideas there. But what about pre-distribution? What about looking at the way the International Monetary Fund actually creates new money? It's called special drawing rights. And what about changing the rules so that we just create the money? And even if it's inflationary to some extent, it would be a minor problem compared to the problems we have otherwise. But it's unlikely it would even be that, because you're actually going to employ these about 1 billion people worldwide who are underemployed or unemployed to do this work. So you need to change the rules of the IMF. Now this is quite complicated. George Soros, the financier, has written on this, and then he said, well, what's the point? The US is going to block it anyway. But so the main thing is actually to mobilize support and understanding of this. But the other aspect of the World Future Council is going to be an ongoing, permanent institution. I know my Buddhist friends always say you must never say permanent, nothing is permanent. But it's not one of these short-term commissions which runs out of money and steam and membership after the next 3 years. That's, of course, quite a challenge, because it means that people have to commit to it for the foreseeable future, although they're not going to be appointed to it for life or something like that. But it's very important. I mean, I've set up a couple of international institutions in my life, and I know that it takes 3, ideally 5 years, 3 to 5 years to get recognized, to get major funding, to be seen as so important, indispensable. People believe you're going to stay. When you start something, when I started the Alternative Nobel Prize, the Right Livelihood Awards, the first year, of course I was totally unknown. I went back to Sweden, where I haven't lived since I was 10, and there was serious speculation in a major Swedish newspaper whether this was a KGB plot or a CIA plot to discredit the Nobel Prizes. And the second year I was just some sort of crazy person, and in the 5th year we were invited to present these awards in Parliament. It takes a few years. That's why it needs to be a permanent institution. And the other thing which is unique about it is that it integrates responses to the crisis we're facing. So far you will find that there is this specialization. For example, you will find some books on what they call in energy saving, what they call factor 4, factor 5, factor 10. basically you can have the same amount of living standards, of economic well-being, but using 1/10 or 1/4 of the energy. And this began by two of the winners of the Right Livelihood Award, Henri and Hunter Lovins in the USA, picked up by a German professor, Schmidt-Bleek, Wuppertal Institute. I don't know what it has been published in Estonian, but when I read this, I went to one of the authors and I said, but you know, entrepreneurs, businessmen are not stupid, so if this is true, why aren't they doing it? And he said, oh, well, of course, you know, it would need a change in the tax system, it would need a change in this regulation, that regulation, but that's not my business, that's not my area, I don't understand that, because we need to pull these various areas together to come up with an integrated response. Lastly, the World Future Council is based on trust, as I already said, because it will link people who already are trusted. Now, how do you find them? Well, you ask people, and we've been doing this, and you know, I'm sure we'll have some ideas from Estonia and the other countries, you know. And you know, if you think of people reading about this council, and you know, and they say, A is a member of that. Well, that means I'm going to take it seriously because you know I trust A. Now, who are these people? I don't know. I mean, the countries I live, I can tell you some names. In Germany, there was a well-known, very charismatic actor who 20 years ago announced after one of his TV shows he was going to quit his career as acting. He's going to Ethiopia and work to help poor children in Ethiopia. And he's done that ever since for the past 20, 25 years. His name is Karl-Heinz Böhm. And so in Germany, for example, if people see, Karl-Heinz Böhm is a member of that council, that'd be one name they would resonate with. And I'm sure there are people like that in every country. Lastly, the project, which is a huge project, of course, is based on the conviction that in crisis, in times of crisis, big steps are easier to take than small steps, because big steps can mobilize people. I mean, they can make us enthusiastic because we know that we feel that's adequate to the problem. But small steps, you know, what's the point? You know, I'm going to do this, but if nobody else does it, why should I waste my time? It's not going to help anyway. And that's why I said, you know, we now need to focus on the big steps, because we are on a collision course with our future. But we have the means to solve these problems. There are problems we have created. I mean, can we solve all of them? Probably not. We have wasted lots of time. Global warming, if we had started doing what we need to do now 20 years ago, would certainly be much less serious and threatening. But does that mean it's hopeless? As some people say. Of course not. You know, whether sea levels rise 1 meter or 4 meters makes a big difference to very, very many people in the world. Whether temperatures go up, you know, by half a degree or by 3 degrees makes a huge difference to almost everybody in the world. I think we need a body which basically speaks out against the present global model, or counterbalances it. As I see, the present global model is based on telling us all to compete for the cheapest. We must, you know, the way forward is to have global competition for the cheapest. That comes, of course, from the USA. The European model has never been that. I mean, the model on which post-war Europe has been built has been cooperation for the best. And I believe that, you know, we need institutions to affirm that. That's what I said in the final speech I gave in Brussels there a few weeks ago. Europe needs a global vision. Europe at the moment doesn't even seem to have a European vision. The USA has a global vision, and especially under the present administration, is one which is increasingly threatening all our future. As I said before, this is not the answer to all our problems. It's a prerequisite for that answer. It is standing up and speaking up for a different worldview than the one which is now ruling. At the moment, we are told that the answer to all our crises is to buy more. I mean, this is President Bush asked by his mother what she could do to help after the September 11th terrorist attacks. He said, Mom, if you really want to help, go out and buy. I mean, we are facing at the same time a situation where happiness in the US is actually going down. They have consumed huge parts of the world's resources and of our future over the past 40 years. And America is actually less happy than their parents were 40 years ago. So, you know, why? Then I came across this only a few days ago, and I must say it really shocked me. Statistics of childhood health in the USA Childhood obesity in the USA has gone up 3 times since 1980. Juvenile diabetes increased 104%. Autism is up 1,000 times in one generation. And asthma plus 75%. Life-threatening food allergies have doubled in the past decade, and allergies have gone up 6-fold. They argue about the reasons. Is it nutrition, lack of exercise, pollution, chemicals, too many vaccinations? They don't yet know. But what is clear is that the American way of life, which we are told by American politicians is so sacred that nothing can, it's rather threatening, destroys not just the planet, but even harms America's children. But still in Europe, if you look at the terminology of reform, when European politicians talk about reform, you find that they're usually talking about following the American model, following the Anglo-Saxon model. And one key aspect of this is, of course, this belief that economics must take over all other, stands paramount in all other values. Economic thinking must take over. The answer to all your proposals, which is supposed to kill it off, is, well, how are we going to pay for that? As if that is the main problem. And the American sociologist, Professor Benjamin Barber, wrote recently, he said it's very strange that when we have the church controlling all sectors of society, then we call that a theocracy, and we say this is undemocratic and unfree. And when we have a state, a one-party state, controlling all sectors of society, as you know from history, that is totalitarianism, and we say it's unfree and undemocratic. But it's when the economic sector controls the whole of society, and then we say that it's the height of freedom and democracy. And of course, this, I think, is the main challenge we're standing in front of now. I mean, to say that we can't do these things because of no money, we can't afford these drastic changes in our ways of life, which we need to preserve a healthy planet for our children. We can't afford it. I mean, it's like saying we can't afford to live on this planet. It's obviously an absolute absurdity. Of course, we can afford it. We can afford to do it. The great British economist John Maynard Keynes once said that whatever a society can do, it can also afford. And there's no money around. If you talk to these economic investment experts, they worry there's too much money around. Andy C, who works for Morgan Stanley, said last year, the main problem in the world today is there's too much money. Obviously, not being invested in the right ways, but we can change those rules if we want to. So how will the World Future Council change this? It will work, as I said, with parliamentarians, with governments, with the UN, to identify best policies and then push for their implementation through so-called action alerts, through working with civil society organizations to mobilize support for them. So that we have a step-by-step program how we get from here to that. We are at the moment doing a series of books on each of these 24 global crises, which were identified you'll find on our website, worldfuturecouncil.org. And for each one of them, we've asked the authors to come up with a short executive summary saying, where are we? Where are we heading to? Where could we be headed to? What's the best we know, which we could be doing, and what are the steps from here to there? Also, the Council will be setting norms. Its moral power is, when you talk to people in the global south, what they feel is most important, because at the moment they feel their own values are all disappearing, and they just have this huge pressure to just become global consumers. And that's why, of course, they are going from poverty to debt. In southern India, landless laborers said, okay, so we may have a bit more money than we had 10, 15 years ago. So why are we more in debt? Because they said 10, 15 years ago we could buy our children shoes from the local shoemaker in the village, or we could get them through an exchange. Now, if our children wear those shoes to school, they get mocked. Now they say to us, Dad, I need a pair of Nike, as shown on the television advertisements. And so my Indian friend said we need a body, a credible institution which speaks up and sends out a different message. Will it be heard? I think there's a good chance it will. In India, the Right Livelihood Awards have a high profile. We would certainly have access to the media there. Even we found in Germany before, when this initiative was first launched, We already got German television contacting us with a budget and saying we'd like to televise these meetings so we can get this World Future Council going. Which to me again was quite amazing, because as you know, normally you have an idea, you work on it for years and years and years, and you think how can you get television interested? And here they were coming up with a budget even before the council existed. So I think it is an idea whose time has come. We've got a number of endorsements. We got the initial funding from Germany and from individuals in Switzerland. We had about 450 nominations of suitable individuals for the council, coming from about 80 countries. First 20 or so of those we have chosen from those which have a lot of support, because we have to get a start somewhere. They will then choose the next 25 and slowly moving up to 100. And they are meeting for the first time in Geneva at the end of May. And we also created a board of advisors and donors, founding donors. Founding donors are those who come in as a major donor and want to, if they don't want to be anonymous, or happy to see their name go into history as somebody who's made this possible. Normally the person who would endow a university professorship or university institute, I think those are the kind of people we're looking for as founding donors. Because without the 3-year funding to make sure that this can actually develop, we will not launch the council. And part of that has to do with the people you will need to win to take part in such a council. As you can imagine, these people will be extremely busy. And one of them said to us, convince me that I'm not going to spend another 5 years of my life working to produce another non-binding document. So we need to convince them of that. That's why we need the initial. And we put that out and said, we calculated that it needs €5 million to be launched. A small amount